The box arrived on a Tuesday wrapped in plain brown paper with no return address. Clara had been expecting a package, but not this one. She had ordered a new set of watercolor paints, something to distract her from the monotony of her life. But this box was too small, too light to be her paints. She turned it over in her hands, feeling the weight shift inside, and frowned. The postmark was smudged, unreadable. She hesitated for a moment, then tore the paper away. Inside was a small velvet box, the kind that might hold a piece of jewelry. Clara's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't bought herself anything like this, and she couldn't think of anyone who would send her a gift. Her birthday wasn't for months, and she wasn't close enough to anyone to warrant an unexpected present. She opened the box. Inside was a necklace. The chain was thin, almost delicate, but it had a strange, dull sheen to it, like it had been polished but still refused to shine. The pendant was a small, unremarkable circle no bigger than a penny with a single word etched into its surface: judgment. Clara frowned. It wasn't her style, she preferred bold, colorful pieces, but there was something about it that drew her in. She lifted it from the box, surprised by how cold it felt against her skin. The chain slithered through her fingers like a living thing, and for a moment she thought she heard a faint whisper so soft she couldn't make out the words. She shook her head. It was just a necklace. Probably a mistake, something sent to the wrong address. But as she held it, she felt an odd compulsion to put it on. It was as if the necklace itself was urging her, pulling her toward it. Clara hesitated, then clasped it around her neck. The moment the clasp clicked into place, she felt a strange sensation, like a weight settling on her chest. It wasn't heavy, not at first, but it was there, a constant pressure that made her breath catch. She touched the pendant, half expecting it to be warm, but it was still cold, almost icy. She looked in the mirror. The necklace looked ordinary enough, but there was something unsettling about the way it hung against her skin, as if it didn't quite belong. She shook her head again, trying to dispel the unease. It was just a necklace. A strange, unexpected gift, but nothing more. That night, as she lay in bed, she thought she heard the whisper again. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there, a voice that seemed to come from inside her own head. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, judgmental, accusing. She sat up, her heart pounding. The necklace felt heavier now, the weight pressing down on her chest. She reached for the clasp, intending to take it off, but her fingers hesitated. There was something stopping her, some instinct that told her not to remove it. Clara lay back down, trying to ignore the weight, the whisper. She told herself it was just her imagination, that she was tired, that she was overthinking things. But as she drifted off to sleep, the whisper grew louder, more insistent. And the necklace grew heavier. The next morning, Clara woke with a start. The necklace was still there, cold against her skin, the weight on her chest now unmistakable. She sat up, rubbing her eyes, and looked in the mirror. The pendant seemed to gleam faintly, the word judgment catching the light in a way that made her stomach twist. She reached for the clasp again, determined to take it off, but as her fingers touched the metal, she froze. The whisper was back, louder now, a voice that seemed to echo in her skull. "You know what you've done." Clara's breath caught. She didn't know what the voice meant, but it sent a chill down her spine. She pulled her hand away from the clasp, her heart racing. The necklace felt heavier than ever, the chain digging into the back of her neck. She tried to shake off the feeling, telling herself it was just her imagination. She had a busy day ahead, work, errands, the usual routine. She couldn't afford to dwell on some strange necklace and the weird dreams it had given her. But as she went about her day, the weight never left her. It was there as she brushed her teeth, as she made coffee, as she walked to the bus stop. By the time she got to work, it felt like she was carrying a stone around her neck. Clara worked as a receptionist at a small law firm, a job that was as dull as it was thankless. She spent most of her day answering phones, filing paperwork, and dealing with clients who were either angry or impatient. It wasn't the life she had imagined for herself, but it paid the bills. That morning, as she sat at her desk, the necklace seemed to grow heavier with every passing minute. She tried to ignore it, focusing on her work, but the weight was distracting, almost oppressive. By lunchtime, she was exhausted, her shoulders aching from the strain. She decided to take a walk, hoping the fresh air would clear her head. As she stepped outside, she noticed a homeless man sitting on the corner, holding a cardboard sign. She had seen him before, he was a regular in the area, but she had never stopped to talk to him. Today, though, something made her pause. The man looked up at her, his eyes tired but kind. "Spare any change?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Clara hesitated. She had a few dollars in her pocket, but she had been planning to buy herself a coffee. She glanced at the man, then at the necklace, which seemed to grow heavier as she stood there. "You could help him," the whisper said, its tone almost mocking. "But you won't." Clara's cheeks burned. She looked away, muttering an apology, and hurried down the street. The necklace felt like a lead weight now, the chain cutting into her skin. She could feel the pendant pressing against her chest, the word judgment burning into her flesh. By the time she got back to the office, she was sweating, her hands trembling. She sat down at her desk, trying to steady her breathing, but the weight was unbearable. She reached for the clasp again, desperate to take the necklace off, but the whisper stopped her. "You can't escape it," the voice said, cold and relentless. "You carry your sins with you." Clara's vision blurred. She felt like she was suffocating, the weight crushing her chest. She stumbled to the bathroom, locking herself in a stall, and sank to the floor. The necklace was so heavy now that she could barely lift her head. She didn't know how long she sat there, her breath coming in shallow gasps, but eventually the weight began to ease. The whisper faded, the pendant growing cold and still against her skin. Clara wiped her eyes, her hands shaking, and stood up. She looked in the mirror. The necklace looked the same as it had that morning, but she felt different. She felt guilty. Guilty for not helping the homeless man, guilty for being selfish, guilty for things she couldn't even name. She touched the pendant, her fingers brushing over the word judgment. She didn't understand what was happening, but one thing was clear: the necklace wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was something else, something alive, something that knew her better than she knew herself. And it wasn't going to let her go. Clara spent the rest of the day in a daze. The necklace's weight had lessened, but it was still there, a constant reminder of something. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but the guilt lingered, gnawing at the edges of her mind. By the time she left work, she was exhausted, her shoulders slumped under the invisible burden. She decided to stop by the grocery store on her way home. As she walked through the aisles, the necklace seemed to grow heavier with every step. She tried to ignore it, focusing on her shopping list, but the whisper was back, faint but insistent. "You're forgetting something," it said. Clara frowned. She had everything she needed: milk, bread, eggs, but the whisper wouldn't let up. She glanced around the store, her eyes landing on a display of canned goods. A sign above it read, "Donate to the local food bank. Help those in need." The necklace grew heavier, the chain digging into her skin. Clara hesitated, then grabbed a few cans and added them to her cart. The weight eased slightly, but the whisper didn't stop. "Is that all?" it asked, its tone mocking. Clara's cheeks burned. She added a few more cans, then a bag of rice, then a box of pasta. By the time she reached the checkout, her cart was overflowing with donations. The cashier gave her a curious look but didn't say anything. As Clara left the store, the necklace felt lighter, but the relief was short-lived. The whisper was still there, quieter now, but persistent. "You can't buy your way out of this," it said. Clara ignored it, loading the groceries into her car. She didn't understand what the necklace wanted from her, but she was determined to figure it out. She drove to the local food bank and dropped off the donations, feeling a small sense of satisfaction as she handed them over. But as she got back into her car, the necklace grew heavier again. The whisper returned, louder this time. "What about the lie?" Clara froze. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel, her knuckles turning white. She knew exactly what the whisper was referring to. Earlier that day, her boss had asked her if she had finished filing the paperwork for an important case. Clara had said yes, even though she hadn't. She had been distracted, overwhelmed by the necklace's weight, and had completely forgotten about it. When her boss asked, she had panicked and lied. The necklace seemed to pulse against her skin, the word judgment burning into her chest. Clara's breath came in short, shallow gasps. She knew she had to fix this, but the thought of admitting her mistake filled her with dread. She drove back to the office, her hands trembling on the wheel. The building was dark, everyone gone for the day, but Clara had a key. She let herself in, the silence pressing down on her like a physical weight. She went straight to her desk and pulled out the paperwork. It took her hours to finish, her fingers clumsy and slow, but she didn't stop until it was done. She left the completed files on her boss's desk, along with a note apologizing for the delay. As she left the office, the necklace felt lighter, but the whisper was still there. "You can't undo it," it said. "But you can try to make it right." Clara didn't respond. She was too tired, too overwhelmed. She drove home in silence, the necklace's weight a constant reminder of her guilt. When she got home, she collapsed onto the couch, too exhausted to move. The necklace felt almost normal now, the weight bearable, but she knew it wouldn't last. The whisper had made it clear. This was just the beginning. She touched the pendant, her fingers brushing over the word judgment. She didn't know what the necklace wanted from her, but she was starting to understand one thing. It wasn't going to let her forget her sins, and it wasn't going to let her off easy. The days blurred together, each one heavier than the last. Clara's life had become a cycle of guilt and repentance, the necklace dictating her every move. It was as if the pendant had become a part of her, its cold weight a constant reminder of her failings. She tried to ignore it, to go about her life as normal, but the whisper was always there, nudging her, judging her. One evening, after another grueling day at work, Clara found herself standing in front of her bathroom mirror. She had avoided looking at herself for days, afraid of what she might see. But now she couldn't look away. The necklace hung heavily around her neck, the chain digging into her skin. The pendant gleamed dully in the light, the word judgment staring back at her like an accusation. Clara's reflection looked tired, her eyes shadowed, her face pale. She looked broken. She reached up to touch the necklace, her fingers trembling. The whisper was there, as always, but it was quieter now, almost contemplative. "Do you see it?" it asked. Clara frowned. "See what?" "The truth," the whisper replied. "The truth about yourself." Clara's breath caught. She didn't want to see the truth. She didn't want to face whatever the necklace was trying to show her. But she couldn't look away. The mirror seemed to shift, the reflection wavering like the surface of a pond. Clara's image blurred, then sharpened again, but it wasn't her anymore. It was someone else. The woman in the mirror looked like Clara, but her eyes were cold, her expression hard. She was dressed in a sharp business suit, her hair perfectly styled, her makeup flawless. She looked powerful, confident, but there was something cruel in her smile. Clara stared at the reflection, her heart pounding. Who is that?" "It's you," the whisper said. "Or who you could have been." The woman in the mirror tilted her head, studying Clara with a look of disdain. "You're weak," she said, her voice sharp and cutting. "You always have been. You let people walk all over you and you never fight back. You could have been so much more, but you chose to be this." Clara's hands clenched into fists. "That's not true," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm not weak." The woman in the mirror laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "Aren't you? You let your boss take credit for your work. You let your so-called friends use you. You let your family dictate your life. You've never stood up for yourself, not once. And now you're here wearing that thing around your neck, letting it control you. Tell me, Clara, how is that not weak?" Clara's vision blurred with tears. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but the words wouldn't come. The woman in the mirror was right. She had always been a pushover, always afraid to stand up for herself. She had let people take advantage of her, had let them shape her life into something she didn't even recognize. The necklace grew heavier, the chain cutting into her skin. The whisper was louder now, almost deafening. "You can't run from this," it said. "You have to face it." Clara sank to the floor, her back against the wall. She buried her face in her hands, the tears streaming down her cheeks. She didn't want to face it. She didn't want to see the truth about herself, about her life. But she couldn't escape it. The woman in the mirror watched her, her expression unreadable. "You have a choice," she said. "You can keep living like this, letting everyone else control you, or you can change. But you have to decide, Clara. You have to choose." Clara looked up, her eyes red and swollen. "How?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "How do I change?" The woman in the mirror smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. "You start by taking responsibility," she said. "For your actions, for your choices, for your life. You stop letting other people dictate who you are. And you take off that necklace." Clara's hand went to the pendant, her fingers brushing over the word judgment. She had tried to take it off before, but something had always stopped her. This time, though, she felt a spark of determination. She wasn't sure if she was ready to face the truth, but she knew she couldn't keep living like this. She reached for the clasp, her fingers trembling. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, but she ignored it. She took a deep breath, then unclasped the necklace. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the weight lifted, the chain falling away from her neck. Clara gasped, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. She looked at the necklace in her hand, the pendant gleaming dully in the light. The woman in the mirror smiled again, but this time it was almost kind. "Good," she said. "Now you're ready." The reflection wavered, then shifted back to Clara's own face. She looked at herself in the mirror, her eyes red but clear. She didn't know what was going to happen next, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had control. She set the necklace on the counter, the pendant staring up at her like an accusation. She didn't know if she was ready to face her sins, but she knew one thing. She wasn't going to let the necklace control her anymore. Clara woke the next morning feeling lighter, freer. The necklace lay on her nightstand, its chain coiled like a sleeping serpent. She stared at it for a long moment, half expecting it to move, to whisper, to pull her back into its grasp. But it remained still, silent. She dressed quickly, avoiding the mirror, and left the necklace where it was. She didn't want to wear it, didn't want to feel its weight again. But as she walked to work, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was still with her, its presence lingering like a shadow. The day passed in a blur. Clara tried to focus on her work, but her mind kept drifting back to the necklace, to the reflection in the mirror, to the woman who had called her weak. She didn't feel weak anymore, but she didn't feel strong either. She felt uncertain. That evening, as she walked home, she passed the homeless man again. He was sitting in his usual spot, his cardboard sign propped up against his knees. Clara hesitated, then reached into her purse and pulled out a $20 bill. She handed it to the man, her hand trembling slightly. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft but sincere. Clara nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She walked away quickly, her heart pounding. The necklace wasn't around her neck, but she could still feel its weight, its judgment. She had done the right thing, hadn't she? So why did she still feel so guilty? When she got home, the necklace was still on her nightstand. She picked it up, the chain cold against her skin. The whisper was back, faint but insistent. "You can't escape it," it said. "You carry your sins with you." Clara's hand tightened around the pendant. "I'm trying," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm trying to do better." "Trying isn't enough," the whisper replied. "You have to face them, all of them." Clara's breath caught. She didn't want to face her sins. She didn't want to remember all the times she had lied, cheated, hurt people. But she knew the whisper was right. She couldn't keep running from them. She sat down on the edge of her bed, the necklace clutched in her hand. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and let the memories come. She remembered the time she had lied to her best friend, telling her she was too busy to help when she really just didn't want to. She remembered the time she had stolen money from her mother's purse, blaming it on her younger brother. She remembered the time she had spread a rumor about a coworker just to make herself look better. Each memory was like a punch to the gut, the guilt and shame overwhelming. The necklace grew heavier in her hand, the chain coiling around her fingers like a living thing. The whisper was louder now, more insistent. "You see it now, don't you?" it said. "You see what you've done." Clara nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I see it," she whispered. "I see it all." "And what are you going to do about it?" the whisper asked. Clara didn't know. She didn't know how to make things right, how to undo the damage she had done. But she knew she had to try. She picked up her phone and dialed her best friend's number. It rang 3 times before she answered. "Clara," her friend said, her voice cautious. "I'm sorry," Clara said, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry for lying to you, for not being there when you needed me. I was selfish and I hurt you and I'm sorry." There was a long pause, then her friend sighed. "Thank you," she said. I needed to hear that." Clara nodded even though her friend couldn't see her. "I'll do better," she said. "I promise." She hung up and immediately dialed her mother's number. It was harder to admit what she had done, harder to face the disappointment in her mother's voice, but she did it. And then she called her brother, apologizing for blaming him for something he hadn't done. By the time she hung up, she was exhausted, her face wet with tears. But she felt lighter. The necklace was still in her hand, but it didn't feel as heavy anymore. The whisper was quieter, almost gentle. "You're not done," it said. "But it's a start." Clara nodded. She knew she wasn't done. There were still things she needed to make right, still people she needed to apologize to. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was on the right path. She set the necklace back on the nightstand, the pendant gleaming dully in the light. She didn't know if she would ever wear it again, but she knew one thing. She wasn't going to let it control her anymore. Clara's journey of atonement was far from over, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope. The necklace remained on her nightstand, a silent observer of her transformation. She no longer felt its oppressive weight, but its presence was a constant reminder of the work she still had to do. Over the next few days, Clara continued to make amends. She apologized to her coworker for spreading the rumor. Though the conversation was awkward and painful, she volunteered at the local food bank, donating not just food but her time. She even reached out to an old friend she had drifted away from, mending a bridge she had thought was burned forever. Each act of repentance lifted a little more of the burden from her shoulders. The whisper grew quieter, its tone less accusatory and more guiding. It was as if the necklace recognized her efforts, rewarding her with moments of peace. But Clara knew there was one final step she had to take. One sin she had buried so deep she had almost convinced herself it didn't exist. It was the hardest to face, the one that had haunted her for years. When she was 16, Clara had been in a car accident. She had been driving recklessly, showing off for her friends, and she had lost control of the car. No one had been seriously hurt, but the other driver, a young mother with a baby in the backseat, had been traumatized. Clara had lied to the police, blaming the accident on a mechanical failure. She had never told the truth, not even to her parents. The memory had haunted her for years, but she had buried it, telling herself it was in the past, that it didn't matter anymore. But the necklace had brought it back to the surface, forcing her to confront it. One evening, Clara sat at her kitchen table, a piece of paper and a pen in front of her. She stared at the blank page, her hands trembling. The whisper was there, faint but insistent. "You know what you have to do," it said. Clara nodded. She picked up the pen and began to write. She wrote a letter to the woman she had hurt all those years ago, apologizing for her lies, for her recklessness, for the trauma she had caused. She didn't know if the woman would ever read it, but she had to try. When she was finished, she folded the letter and sealed it in an envelope. She looked up the woman's address. It wasn't hard to find, thanks to social media, and wrote it on the front. She would mail it tomorrow. As she set the letter aside, she felt a strange sense of relief, as if a weight she hadn't even realized she was carrying had been lifted. The whisper was silent now, the necklace cold and still on her nightstand. Clara picked it up, the chain sliding through her fingers. She didn't feel the urge to put it on, but she didn't feel the need to hide it away either. It was just a necklace now, a reminder of the journey she had been on. She walked to her window and opened it, letting the cool night air wash over her. She held the necklace in her hand, the pendant gleaming in the moonlight. For a moment, she considered throwing it away, letting it disappear into the night. But she didn't. Instead, she clasped it around her neck. The weight was still there, but it was different now. It wasn't oppressive, wasn't crushing. It was a reminder, not of her sins, but of her growth. She had faced her mistakes, made amends, and taken responsibility. She wasn't perfect, but she was trying. The whisper was gone, replaced by a quiet, almost peaceful silence. Clara touched the pendant, her fingers brushing over the word judgment. She didn't feel judged anymore. She felt free. She closed the window and sat down on her bed, the necklace resting lightly against her chest. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to face it. The necklace had weighed her down, but it had also lifted her up. It had shown her the truth about herself, forced her to confront her sins, and guided her toward redemption. It had been a burden, but it had also been a gift. And now it was just a necklace,